The dirt in the paddock was soaked with blood, and 15 armed men were backing away from a 2-ton beast they couldn't break. Up on the balcony, the boss watched his men file, his patience ticking down to a bullet. Down in the mud, holding a dented bucket, was Tessa. 6 months pregnant, minimum wage. She didn't have armor, a whip, or a gun. She just had an apple in her pocket, and she was entirely out of funds to give. The Rossi estate wasn't a home. It was a fortress masquerading as old money. High limestone walls, wrought iron gates thick enough to stop a truck, and a security detail that looked less like guards and more like a paramilitary outfit awaiting deployment. Tessa hated the mornings here. The air was always damp, smelling of cut grass and the sharp chemical tang of whatever they used to bleach the courtyard stones overnight. She pressed a hand against the small of her back, leaning her weight onto the rough wooden handle of her push broom. 6 months pregnant. The baby was sitting low today, pressing against her pelvis with a kind of dull, persistent ache that made standing feel like a punishment. She wore a gray uniform dress that was 2 sizes too big, bought at a thrift store to accommodate her growing stomach. It hung off her shoulders. She was 24, entirely alone, and surviving on the grim reality that organized crime paid its cleaning staff strictly in cash, with 0 questions asked about missing references. "Keep moving, Tessa." The voice belonged to Miller, the head of the ground security. He was a thick-necked man who wore cheap cologne and a perpetual scowl. He didn't look at her when he spoke. He didn't look at any of the maids. To him, they were just furniture that occasionally needed replacing. "I'm moving," Tessa muttered, dragging the broom across the concrete outside the stables. She preferred the stables. The house was dangerous. In the house, you might hear a conversation you weren't supposed to hear. You might walk into a room and see someone tied to a chair. Out here, there was just horse manure, hay, and the quiet company of animals who didn't care about turf wars or extortion rackets. A heavy diesel engine grumbled up the main drive. Tessa stopped sweeping. A massive, reinforced horse trailer, pulled by a matte black heavy-duty truck, crawled through the gates. The tires crunched over the gravel. Damian Russo stepped out onto the second-floor balcony of the main house. He didn't make a grand entrance. He never did. Damian was a man who inhabited space with a terrifying stillness. He wore a dark tailored suit, no tie, collar open. He leaned against the stone balustrade, holding a cup of espresso. From down in the courtyard, he looked like a statue. But the entire estate shifted its center of gravity the moment he appeared. The guard straightened. The chatter died. Tessa kept her eyes on the dirt. "You didn't look at the boss. That was rule number 1. "All right, let's get this bastard unloaded," Miller barked, waving a hand at a dozen guards lingering near the garage. "Boss paid 7 figures for him. Do not scratch him." The trailer doors unlatched with a heavy metallic clank. The sound that came from inside wasn't a whinny. It was a roar. It sounded prehistoric. The heavy steel ramp slammed down into the dirt, kicking up a cloud of dry earth. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the shadows inside the trailer exploded. A massive black Frisian stallion launched itself down the ramp. It was a nightmare of muscle and bone, standing over 17 hands high. Its coat was slick with nervous sweat, matted and dark. Its eyes were wide, rolling back to show the whites, wild and unseeing. "Grab the lead! Grab the goddamn lead!" Miller shouted, scrambling backward. 3 guards rushed forward. They didn't know horses. They knew how to break fingers, how to collect debts. But they didn't know a damn thing about an animal that operated purely on a flight or fight response. And this animal had clearly decided to fight. The stallion reared up, its front hooves striking the air. A guard named Carter lunged for the halter rope dragging in the dirt. Crack. The horse's left hoof caught Carter square in the shoulder. The sound of the collarbone snapping was loud enough to echo off the stable walls. Carter went down screaming, rolling in the dust. "Box him in," Miller yelled, pulling his sidearm out of pure panicked instinct before realizing you don't shoot a boss's $1 million purchase. "Get the ropes, everyone." 15 men. 15 men in tactical gear and tailored suits, swarming the paddock like angry ants. They shouted. They threw lassos that missed or slipped off the thick, thrashing neck. Tessa stood frozen by the water trough. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but not from fear of the horse. She felt sick watching the men. They were cornering him, making it worse. The stallion spun, kicking out with his hind legs, catching another guard in the thigh. The man went down with a sickening thud. The horse was backed against the heavy wooden fence of the paddock. He was trapped. His flanks heaved. White foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. He was going to kill someone, and then Damian Russo was going to have him put down. Tessa looked up at the balcony. Damian hadn't moved. He hadn't spilled a drop of his espresso. He was watching his men get dismantled by an animal, his expression completely unreadable. Down in the dirt, Miller grabbed a heavy leather lunge whip from the stable wall. "Back off him! I said back off!" Miller snarled, raising the whip. The stallion dropped his head, ears pinned flat against his skull. The universal warning sign. He was preparing to charge. Tessa didn't think. Thinking would have reminded her that she had no health insurance. Thinking would have reminded her of the child growing inside her. Instead, she felt the heavy, bruised apple in her apron pocket. She had stolen it from the kitchen to eat when her blood sugar crashed around noon. She dropped the broom. It clattered against the stone. "Miller, stop," Tessa said. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't a scream, but it was entirely out of place. It cut through the chaotic shouting of the guards because it was the only sound that wasn't laced with testosterone and panic. Miller turned, his face flushed dark red, a vein pulsing at his temple. He looked at Tessa like he had forgotten she existed, which he probably had. "Get back to work, you stupid cow, before you get trampled," he spat, turning his attention back to the horse. He raised the whip again. Tessa stepped off the concrete and into the dirt of the paddock. "I said stop," she repeated. She walked past Miller. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at the two guards groaning on the ground, or the others holding ropes with white-knuckled grips. The silence that fell over the courtyard was sudden and absolute. The only sound was the harsh, ragged breathing of the stallion. Tessa stopped about 15 feet from the horse. He was trembling. Up close, the sheer size of him was terrifying. A wall of muscle that could crush her skull with a single misplaced step. But Tessa didn't see a monster. She saw a creature that had been stuffed into a metal box, hauled across the country, surrounded by loud, aggressive men smelling of gunpowder and adrenaline, and backed into a corner. She knew what it felt like to be cornered by loud, aggressive men. "Hey," she said, her voice dropping to a low, gravelly murmur. "It's okay. They're just idiots." The stallion tossed his head, a short, sharp movement. His hooves danced in the dirt, indecisive. He snorted, a wet, heavy sound. Tessa didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her hands resting on the swell of her stomach. She kept her eyes low, looking at the horse's chest, not meeting his eyes. Direct eye contact was a challenge. She wasn't here to challenge him. She was just there. "Nobody's going to hit you," she murmured. The words meant more for the rhythm of her voice than the meaning. She shifted her weight, slowly reaching into her apron pocket. Behind her, Miller hissed, "Get out of there! Boss, I'm gonna pull her out!" "Shut up, Miller." The voice came from above. It was quiet, but it carried the weight of an anvil. Damien Russo. He had finally spoken. Nobody moved. Tessa pulled the apple from her pocket. It was slightly bruised, a dull red. She held it in her right hand. Slowly, excruciatingly slowly, she extended her arm. Palm flat. Open. "Come on," she whispered. The horse watched her. His ears flicked forward, then pinned back, then forward again. He was processing. The threat level had suddenly dropped. The screaming had stopped. The whips were lowered. There was just this small, round woman standing still, offering food. For a long minute, the world just held its breath. Tessa felt a drop of sweat roll down her spine. Her arm began to ache. The baby gave a sharp, sudden kick against her ribs, protesting the tension. She winced slightly, but didn't pull her hand back. The stallion took half a step forward. Tessa didn't flinch. He took another step. The massive head lowered. The scent of him washed over her. Dust, sweat, sweet hay, and raw animal heat. He was close now. Close enough that she could see the fine veins mapping his muzzle. Close enough that his hot breath hit her face. He stopped, just inches from her outstretched hand. He blew out a long, shuddering breath, the air whistling through his nostrils. Then soft velvet lips brushed against her palm. He took the apple. The crunch was loud in the quiet courtyard. Tessa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She slowly lowered her hand, and then, moving entirely on instinct, she reached up and placed her palm flat against the thick, muscular expanse of the horse's neck. The stallion didn't rear. He didn't bite. He just stood there, chewing the apple, his eyes finally losing that wild, white-rimmed terror. He leaned his heavy head down, pressing it gently against Tessa's shoulder, right above her pregnant belly. Tessa stroked his coarse hair. "There you go," she said softly. "You're just scared. That's all. Me too, big guy. Me too." She took the heavy lead rope that was dangling from his halter. She didn't wrap it around her hand. She just held it loosely. "Come on," she said, turning her back on him. She began to walk toward the open stable doors. She didn't look back to see if he was following. She just walked. Behind her, the heavy, rhythmic thud, thud, thud of the stallion's hooves followed. He trailed after her like a dog. She led him into the cool, dark interior of the stable, guided him into the largest double-folding stall, and unclipped the lid. She slid the heavy wooden door shut and locked it. When Tessa turned around, she was met with 15 blank, staring faces. The guards looked like they had just witnessed a parlor trick they couldn't figure out. Miller's face was pale. He looked from the closed stable door to Tessa, his jaw tight. He looked humiliated. And a humiliated man with a gun was a dangerous thing. Tessa didn't say a word. She felt the adrenaline leaving her body, replaced by a sudden, bone-deep exhaustion. Her knees felt like water. She walked over to where she had dropped her broom, picked it up, and went back to sweeping the dirt. Up on the balcony, Damien Russo finally set his espresso cup down. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of mundane labor and quiet paranoia. Tessa scrubbed the grout in the downstairs bathrooms. She changed the linens in the guest wing. She wiped down the stainless steel counters in the industrial kitchen. Through it all, she kept waiting for the tap on the shoulder. She had embarrassed the security team. More specifically, she had embarrassed Miller. In a place like the Rossi estate, respect was the only currency that mattered. By walking into that paddock and taming a beast that had broken 2 of his men, she had made Miller look incompetent in front of the boss. I'm going to get fired, she thought, tossing a soiled rag into the laundry bin. Or worse, her lower back was screaming. She sat down heavily on an overturned milk crate in the pantry, rubbing her temples. She needed this job. It paid $800 a week, cash, no taxes, no questions about the father who had skipped town the moment the pregnancy test showed 2 lines. She had a shoebox in her tiny, damp apartment with $3,000 in it. It wasn't enough for the hospital bills. It wasn't enough for a crib. The kitchen door swung open. Tessa jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. It was Miller. He filled the doorway, blocking the light. His eyes were cold, scanning the room until they locked onto her sitting on the crate. "Get up," he said. His voice was flat, dead. Tessa stood, her hands instinctively resting on her stomach. "I was just taking a 5-minute—" "I don't care," Miller interrupted. "Wash your hands, fix your hair. Boss wants to see you." The air in the pantry suddenly felt too thick to breathe. "Me? Did I stutter?" Miller sneered. "3rd floor, the main office. Do not make him wait." He turned and walked away, leaving the door swinging on its hinges. Tessa walked over to the industrial sink. She turned on the cold water and scrubbed her hands with harsh dish soap, watching the suds spiral down the drain. She looked at her reflection in the polished metal of the refrigerator. She looked like exactly what she was, a tired pregnant maid with dark circles under her eyes and a uniform covered in dust. She dried her hands, took a deep breath, and walked out of the kitchen. The main house was heavily air-conditioned, silent, and intimidating. The floors were imported marble. The walls were lined with art that Tessa knew cost more than she would make in 3 lifetimes. She climbed the grand staircase, her hand gripping the mahogany railing tightly. Every step sent a jolt of ache through her pelvis. The 3rd floor was the executive level. It smelled of old paper, leather, and faint, expensive cigar smoke. 2 guards stood outside a set of heavy double doors at the end of the hallway. They weren't the thugs from the courtyard. These men wore custom suits. They didn't slouch. They watched her approach with terrifying neutrality. "Tessa," one of them said. It wasn't a question. Yes. He opened the right door and gestured for her to enter. Tessa stepped inside. The office was massive, dominated by a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling estate grounds. The walls were lined with dark wood bookshelves. In the center of the room sat a massive desk carved from a single piece of dark walnut. Damian Russo was sitting behind it. He was reading a file, a pair of reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He didn't look up when she entered. "Close the door," he said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth, but carrying a sharp edge beneath it, like velvet wrapped around a razor blade. Tessa turned and gently pulled the heavy door shut. It clicked with a solid final sound. She turned back and stood awkwardly on the edge of the Persian rug, clutching her hands in front of her. A minute passed, then 2. The silence was a tactic. She knew that. He was letting her stew in her own anxiety. She refused to squirm. She stood still, shifting her weight slightly to ease her back. Finally, Damien closed the file. He took off his glasses, set them down, and looked at her. Up close, he was striking, but not conventionally handsome. His face was angular, hard. He had a faint, faded scar running through his left eyebrow. His eyes were dark, calculating, and entirely devoid of warmth. He didn't look at her with lust or pity. He looked at her like a piece of data he was trying to process. "What is your name?" he asked. "Tessa." "Last name?" "Just Tessa." Damien leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. The agency that provides my domestic staff is usually thorough. I don't recall hiring anyone with a missing surname. I'm a subcontractor, sir, Tessa said, keeping her voice steady. I cover shifts for girls who are sick. Ah, off the books. Damien's gaze dropped to her stomach. He stared at it for a long moment. How far along? Tessa felt a spike of defensiveness. 6 months. And the father? Absent. Damien nodded slowly, as if this confirmed a theory. My men tell me you've been working here for 3 weeks. Cleaning the stables, mostly. Avoiding the main house. I prefer the quiet. You certainly made a lot of noise today. Damien stood up. He walked around the desk. He moved with a predatory grace, his footsteps silent on the thick rug. He stopped a few feet away from her. That horse, Damien said, cost me $1.2 million. He is a direct descendant of a champion bloodline. I bought him because I appreciate power. And yet 15 men I pay handsomely to handle violence, couldn't get a halter on him. He tilted his head, studying her. You walked into a pen with a panicked animal that could have crushed your skull, and you gave it an apple. Damien's eyes narrowed slightly. Why? Tessa looked back at him. She was exhausted. The fear was burning off, leaving only the cynical reality of her life. Because he wasn't violent, Mr. Russo. He was just terrified, Tessa said flatly. Your men were treating him like an enemy. They cornered him. If you corner something, it fights back. It doesn't matter how much it costs. Damien stared at her. The silence stretched again. Tessa braced herself. This was it. She had just told a Mafia boss that his men were idiots and his methods were flawed. She waited for him to call the guards. Instead, a slow, small smirk played at the corner of Damien's mouth. It didn't reach his eyes, but it was there. Terrified, Damien repeated. An interesting assessment. He turned his back on her, walking toward the window. He looked down at the courtyard below. I don't employ people who cause scenes, Tessa, he said, his back to her. I rely on order. When my men look foolish, I look foolish. Do you understand? Yes, sir. I'll pack my things. Tessa felt a heavy stone drop in her gut. She was back to zero. Did I tell you to pack your things? Damien's voice snapped like a whip, freezing her in place. He turned around. The smirk was gone. He was all business again. You're done scrubbing floors, Damien said. And you're done hiding in the stables as a ghost. From now on, you are the exclusive handler for that animal. You feed him, you groom him, you walk him. No one else touches him. Tessa blinked, stunned. I'm not a horse trainer, sir. I just had an apple. You have instincts, Damien countered, walking back to his desk. Instincts can't be bought. My men have discipline, but they lack intuition. You handled a volatile asset with efficiency. I reward efficiency. He pulled a thick envelope from a drawer and tossed it onto the desk. Your pay is doubled. Cash, as usual. You report directly to me regarding the horse's progress. Miller no longer has authority over your schedule. Damien sat down, opening a new file. You start immediately. Tessa stared at the envelope. It looked thick. Too thick. Mr. Russo, she started, hesitating. Is there a problem? Damien asked, not looking up. I'm pregnant, Tessa said, stating the obvious. I can't ride him. I can't break him in. Damien finally looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. The intensity in his gaze made her breath hitch. I didn't ask you to break him, Tessa, Damien said quietly. I asked you to handle him. There's a difference. Now take the money and go. Tessa stepped forward, picked up the envelope, and turned toward the door. As her hand touched the brass knob, Damien's voice drifted across the room one last time. And Tessa? She paused, looking over her shoulder. Don't let me catch you eating bruised apples again, he said, his eyes back on his paperwork. I don't run a charity, but I don't starve my employees either. Tell the kitchen to feed you properly. Tessa swallowed hard, nodded once, and slipped out the door. The heavy mahogany shut behind her, but the feeling of his eyes on her back lingered long after she walked away. The envelope sitting on Tessa's cheap Formica table contained $3,200 in cash. Crisp $100 bills bound by a single paper strap. She stared at it while her instant coffee went cold. It was more money than she had ever held at one time. It was rent for 6 months. It was a reliable car, or at least one that wouldn't stall at a red light. It was a hospital bill paid in full. It felt entirely like a trap, but a trap was a luxury you evaluated only when you weren't starving. Tessa put the money in an old metal tea tin, shoved it to the back of her top cabinet, and went to work. Her new routine was strange. The Rossi estate operated on violence, intimidation, and a strict hierarchy. Tessa now existed completely outside of it. Miller and his men gave her a wide berth, their eyes sliding past her as if she were radioactive. She didn't have to sweep the courtyard. She didn't have to bleach the bathrooms. She just had the horse. She named him Atlas. Damien hadn't given him a name, referring to him only as the asset or the animal. But when a creature weighed 2,000 pounds and carried the world's tension in his shoulders, he needed a name that fit. By the end of the first week, Atlas knew her footsteps. When Tessa walked into the barn, the heavy thud of his hooves against the stall door would start. A rhythmic, impatient demand for her presence. She didn't train him. She had no idea how. She simply existed in his space without asking anything of him. She brushed the dried sweat from his black coat until it shone like spilled oil. She picked the packed dirt from his hooves, leaning her heavy, aching body against his massive legs. He never kicked. He never bit. He would lower his massive head, resting his chin heavily on her shoulder, breathing the warm, sweet scent of hay into her hair while she worked. They were two strays, sheltering in the eye of a hurricane, because the hurricane was always raging just outside the barn doors. On a Tuesday, Tessa was leading Atlas out to the back paddock when she saw 3 men dragging a fourth toward the basement of the main house. The man being dragged was bleeding heavily from his nose and mouth, his expensive shoes leaving twin tracks in the gravel. Atlas stopped, his ears pinning back at the scent of copper and adrenaline. He sidestepped, his muscles bunching beneath his dark coat. Tessa didn't gasp. She didn't run. She just stopped, wrapping her fingers a little tighter around the lead rope. "Easy," she murmured, pressing her free hand flat against the horse's neck. She didn't look at the men. She looked at the grass. "It's nothing to do with us. Just keep walking." Up on the second-floor balcony, Damien stood with his hands in his pockets. He watched the bleeding man disappear into the shadows of the basement. Then he looked at Tessa. He noticed the way she hadn't flinched. He noticed the mechanical, dead-eyed way she looked at the ground, as if pretending not to see violence was a survival skill she had perfected long ago. That afternoon, a silver tray was brought down to the stables by one of the kitchen staff. It held roasted chicken, grilled vegetables, and a tall glass of milk. "From Mr. Russo," the cook said, looking intensely uncomfortable being in the barn. "He said to make sure you eat it all." Tessa looked at the food. Her stomach growled violently, a sharp reminder of the meager piece of toast she'd had for breakfast. She didn't send it back. Pride was a calorie-burning emotion she couldn't afford. She sat on an overturned bucket and ate every bite, while Atlas chewed his hay in the stall beside her. By her 28th week, the exhaustion settled deep into Tessa's bones. Her ankles swelled over the tops of her worn sneakers, and the baby pressed against her lungs, making every breath feel shallow and incomplete. She had an appointment at the free clinic across town. It was a Tuesday. She told one of the guards at the front gate she needed the afternoon off, per her arrangement with Damien. She walked the 2 miles to the bus stop in the blistering afternoon heat. The clinic was exactly as she remembered it, smelling of stale sweat and industrial cleaner, packed with tired women holding crying children. She waited 3 hours to see a tired doctor who spent exactly 4 minutes pressing a cold Doppler wand to her stomach. "Heartbeat is steady," the doctor said, not making eye contact. "You're measuring a bit small. Are you eating?" "Yes," Tessa lied. She was eating the food Damien sent down, but years of poor nutrition didn't undo themselves in a month. "Take your prenatals, drink water, see you in a month." Tessa walked out into the fading evening light. The heat hadn't broken. She felt dizzy, a sharp buzzing static filling her ears. She leaned against the brick wall of the clinic, closing her eyes, waiting for the world to stop tilting. A black SUV pulled up to the curb. It didn't park. It idled, blocking the crosswalk. The heavy hum of the engine vibrated in Tessa's chest. The rear window rolled down. Damien Russo was sitting in the back seat staring at her. He didn't look angry. He looked clinical. "Get in," he said. Tessa pushed herself off the brick wall. "I can take the bus." "The bus takes an hour, and you look like you're about to pass out on the pavement," Damien replied, his voice devoid of patience. "Get in the car, Tessa." The front passenger door opened, and a heavily tattooed guard stepped out, holding the back door open for her. Tessa didn't have the energy to argue. She climbed into the back, the heavy leather interior swallowing her. The air conditioning was freezing. She shivered instinctively. Damien didn't look at her as the SUV pulled away. He was typing on a secure phone. "You went to a county clinic," he said, stating it as a fact, not a question. "It's what I can afford. I pay you $3,000 a week." "I'm saving it," Tessa said, wrapping her arms around her stomach. "Babies are expensive, and I don't know how long this job will last." Damien stopped typing. He slowly turned his head to look at her. The streetlights flickered across his face, highlighting the hard lines of his jaw. "You think I'm going to fire you? You're a businessman, Mr. Russo. I'm a pregnant maid handling a horse. Eventually, you'll want someone who can actually ride him. I'm a temporary solution." Damien held her gaze for a long moment. There was no pity in his eyes, only calculation. "Who is the father?" he asked. The pivot was abrupt, jarring. Tessa tightened her jaw. "Nobody. Nobody is a biological impossibility. He was a bartender. He liked his liquor more than he liked responsibility. When I told him I was pregnant, he packed his bags and moved to Vegas. End of story." Damien processed this information. "Does he know where you are?" "No." "Does he have debts?" Tessa frowned. "I don't know. Probably. Why?" "Because people with debts bring problems. I don't like problems near my property." Damien tapped the tinted glass of his window. "You will not return to that clinic. My personal physician will see you at the estate from now on." Tessa shifted in the leather seat, a spike of panic hitting her chest. "I don't want your charity." "It's not charity," Damien snapped, his voice dropping an octave, cold and absolute. "It's asset protection. You handle $1 million animal. If you collapse in the paddock because some overworked county hack missed a vital sign, my horse suffers. You are a component of my operation now. I maintain my components." Tessa stared at the back of the driver's headrest. It was the coldest, most transactional thing anyone had ever said to her. But beneath the ice, there was a strange, twisted kind of security. She wasn't disposable anymore. She was a component. Fine, Tessa whispered. Damien went back to his phone. Eat the damn chicken I send you, Tessa. I won't tell you again. The tension at the estate had been building for a week. Tessa could feel it in the air. The guards were heavily armed now, carrying rifles instead of just sidearms. The main gates remained closed. Black SUVs came and went at all hours of the night, men stepping out with grim faces and dirt on their boots. Tessa kept her head down. She stayed in the barn. Atlas was her anchor. The massive stallion seemed to absorb her anxiety, leaning his heavy weight against her whenever she felt the tremor in her hands return. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. Tessa was brushing out Atlas's mane in the center aisle of the barn. The heavy wooden doors at the front were wide open to catch the breeze. Suddenly, the crack of gunfire shattered the quiet. It wasn't a single shot. It was a rapid, stuttering burst of an automatic weapon echoing from the front courtyard. Atlas screamed. He didn't just whinny. He shrieked, a terrifying primal sound. He reared up, his massive front hooves striking the wooden rafters of the barn. The cross ties snapped like cheap string. "Atlas, no!" Tessa shouted, throwing her arms up to shield her face. The horse came down hard, his hooves slipping on the concrete aisle. He spun, eyes wide and rolling with absolute terror. The gunfire continued outside. Men were shouting. Atlas bolted. He didn't care what was in his way. 2,000 pounds of pure, blind panic surged toward the open barn doors. Tessa was caught between him and the wall. She didn't try to stop him. She pressed her back flat against the rough wood of the stall door, holding her breath, turning her stomach away from the massive body barreling past her. His heavy shoulder clipped her. The impact threw Tessa to the ground. She hit the concrete hard, scraping her elbows and jarring her spine. She curled into a ball instinctively, wrapping her arms around her pregnant belly as the horse thundered out into the chaotic courtyard. Outside, the situation was a mess. 3 heavily armored vehicles had breached the main gate. Damien's men were returning fire from behind marble pillars and overturned tables. And right in the middle of the crossfire was Atlas. The stallion was charging blindly, kicking at the air. A bullet struck the dirt near his hooves, and he reared again, bringing his front legs down on the hood of one of the invading SUVs, caving in the metal with a sickening crunch. Tessa dragged herself up from the barn floor. Her hip throbbed. She tasted blood where she had bitten her lip. She staggered out of the barn. The noise was deafening. The smell of sulfur and burning rubber choked the air. "Atlas!" she screamed. Her voice was entirely lost in the gunfire. From the front steps of the main house, Damien saw her. He was holding a customized rifle, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying violence. He had just dropped a man attempting to flank the fountain. He turned to acquire a new target, and his eyes locked onto the barn. He saw Tessa limping into the open, completely unarmed, walking straight toward the crossfire, her eyes fixed on the panicked horse. "Miller," Damien roared, his voice cutting through the chaos through sheer force of will. "Cover the barn, now!" Damien didn't wait. He vaulted over the stone balustrade. Bullets chipped the limestone around him, but he moved with a reckless, terrifying speed. Tessa was 10 feet away from the horse. Atlas was spinning in tight circles, kicking out. A rival gunman, pinned behind the crushed SUV, raised his weapon, aiming directly at the massive animal thrashing above him. Damien fired twice. The gunman dropped before his finger twitched on the trigger. Damien reached Tessa, grabbing her by the back of her uniform collar. He hauled her backward with brute force, throwing her behind the thick stone base of a decorative statue. "Are you out of your mind?" Damien snarled, pressing his body weight against her to keep her down, as a spray of bullets hit the other side of the statue. Tessa was gasping for air, clutching her stomach. They're going to shoot him. They're going to shoot you. Damien grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were black with adrenaline, a smear of dirt across his cheek. You stay down. Do you understand me? You do not move. He didn't wait for her answer. He unpinned a flashbang grenade from his tactical vest and hurled it over the statue toward the crushed SUV. The blinding flash and deafening pop stunned the remaining attackers. Damien's men surged forward, seizing the moment. The gunfire abruptly shifted from a firefight to an execution. Damien stood up, his rifle raised, scanning the smoke. The threat was neutralized. The courtyard was littered with bodies and brass casings. Atlas was standing by the fountain, trembling violently, covered in white sweat, staring wildly at the carnage. Damien looked down at Tessa. She was still curled behind the statue, her face pale, her hands trembling over her stomach. He slung his rifle over his shoulder. The violence drained out of his posture, replaced by that cold, calculating stillness. He reached down, offering her his hand. Tessa looked at his hand. There was blood on his knuckles. She didn't take it. She pushed herself up against the stone, wincing as her bruised hip took her weight. Damien dropped his hand. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. Did you take a hit? He asked quietly. No, Tessa whispered. I was pushed. By the horse? He was scared. Damien looked at the stallion, then back at Tessa. He reached out, his thumb lightly brushing the dirt from her cheek. The touch was entirely unexpected, burning hot against her cold skin. I told you I protect my assets, Tessa, Damien said, his voice a low rumble. Don't ever walk into my line of fire again. The smell of cordite lingered in the courtyard for 3 days. The bodies were gone within an hour. The blood pressure washed from the limestone before sunset. But the metallic tang of violence stuck in the back of Tessa's throat. She was currently sitting on an examination table in a room she hadn't known existed. It was located in the east wing of the main house, fully equipped like a high-end trauma bay. Stainless steel counters, bright overhead surgical lights, and an ultrasound machine that looked like it belonged in a research hospital. Dr. Caldwell was a man who moved with the quiet efficiency of someone paid heavily to forget what he saw. He had silver hair, cold hands, and didn't ask a single question about the bruised hip Tessa had sustained during the firefight. He ran the ultrasound wand over her stomach. The rhythmic swish, swish, swish of the fetal heartbeat filled the sterile room. Heart rate is 145, Caldwell said, staring at the monitor. Amniotic fluid levels are normal. The placenta shows no signs of abruption. You're bruised, Tessa, and your blood pressure is dangerously high, but the fetus is secure. And the hip? The voice came from the corner of the room. Damien was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed. He had been there the entire time, silent as a shadow, watching the black and white screen with a disturbing level of focus. Caldwell wiped the gel from Tessa's stomach with a paper towel. A deep contusion. Painful, but no fracture. She needs bed rest, Mr. Russo. The adrenaline spike from yesterday's event, combined with her pre-existing exhaustion, is a liability for premature labor. She is 30 weeks along. We need her to reach 37. Understood, Damien said. He pushed off the wall. Leave us, doctor. Caldwell packed his instruments into a leather bag, nodded once, and exited the room. The heavy door clicked shut. Tessa pulled her oversized gray uniform back down over her swollen stomach. She winced as she shifted her weight, the bruise on her hip sending a sharp, hot spike of pain down her leg. She stared at the floor tiles. I'll work from a stool, Tessa said, breaking the silence. I can sit while I brush Atlas. He's calm now. He just needs the routine. You aren't going near the barn, Damien said. Tessa looked up, her jaw tightening. You told me I was the only one who handles him, and I'm telling you that you are on bed rest." Damien walked closer, stopping at the edge of the examination table. He looked down at her. "You think I'm going to let you drag yourself through the dirt right now? You can barely walk." "I need the money, Mr. Russo." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the panic clawing at her throat. "If I don't work, I don't get paid. If I don't get paid, stop." Damien's voice was a low command. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a key card, tossing it onto the metal counter next to her. "You don't live in that damp apartment anymore. Your lease has been broken. Your belongings were moved this morning." Tessa froze. The air left her lungs. You broke into my apartment?" "I relocated an asset to a secure facility," Damien corrected, his tone entirely clinical. "You are moving into the guest suite on the second floor. It has a private bathroom, climate control, and it is 50 feet from the armed guard stationed in the main hall." Tessa grabbed the edge of the examination table. Her knuckles turned white. "You can't just pack up my life. I am your employee, not your property." Damien leaned in. The distance between them vanished. He smelled of clean soap, expensive wool, and a faint trace of dark coffee. "Yesterday an armed man had a sightline on you," Damien said softly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You walked into a crossfire for a horse. You have zero self-preservation instincts, so I will do it for you. You live here now. Your meals will be brought to you. Your salary will continue to be deposited in cash into the safe in your room. When the child is born, we will reassess." He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He stated it as a permanent, immovable fact of the universe. "Why?" Tessa whispered. The cynicism that usually armored her was cracking. "I'm just a maid." Damien stared at her mouth for a fraction of a second before meeting her eyes again. "You aren't just a maid," he said. "You're the only thing on this entire estate that doesn't lie to me. Now take the key card and go to your room." The guest suite was a velvet cage. It had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rear gardens, a king-sized bed with sheets that felt like water, and a walk-in closet where someone had unpacked her cheap, worn clothes and hung them next to a row of brand-new, high-end maternity wear. Tessa hated it. She hated the quiet. She hated the softness. Poverty was loud and sharp. It kept you awake, kept you sharp. Luxury made you slow. It made you dependent. For 2 weeks she paced the thick carpets. She ate the rich, hot meals brought by the kitchen staff. She watched her bankroll grow in the wall safe. And every afternoon she stood by the window and watched the guards try and fail to manage Atlas in the paddock below. The Stallion was regressing. Without Tessa's quiet, grounding presence, he was turning back into the monster Damien had purchased. He paced the fence line, his coat dulling, his ears permanently pinned back. On a suffocatingly hot Thursday, Tessa couldn't take it anymore. She was 32 weeks pregnant. She moved like a ship heavily laden with cargo. She bypassed the guards in the hallway with a flat, dead-eyed stare that dared them to stop her, took the elevator down to the ground floor, and walked out the back doors. The heat hit her like a physical blow. She ignored it. She walked toward the paddock. Miller was standing by the fence, holding a lunge whip, looking furious. 2 guards were inside the enclosure, trying to corner the horse. "Get out," Tessa said as she approached the wooden rails. Miller turned, his face flushing dark red. "You're supposed to be in the house. Boss's orders. Get your men out of the dirt, Miller, before he kicks one of their skulls in." Tessa leaned heavily against the wooden railing, her breathing shallow. "Atlas, hey!" The massive black stallion stopped his frantic pacing. He snapped his head toward the sound of her voice. He let out a low, shuddering sound and immediately trotted to the fence line where she stood. The two guards in the dirt didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled over the opposite fence, entirely willing to surrender the ring. Tessa reached through the wooden rails, pressing her palm flat against the thick, sweaty muscle of the horse's neck. He leaned into her hand, closing his eyes, a massive sigh expanding his ribs. "I know," Tessa murmured, picking a piece of burr from his tangled mane. "I've been gone. I'm sorry." Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind her, heavy, deliberate. Tessa didn't turn around. She knew the cadence of that walk. "I gave you an explicit directive to stay inside," Damien said. His voice wasn't angry. It was dangerous. "He's losing his mind out here," Tessa replied, keeping her eyes on the horse. "He thinks he's been abandoned. Animals don't understand bed rest, Mr. Russo." Damien stopped right beside her. He was close enough that his arm brushed her shoulder. Tessa stiffened, but she didn't pull away. "You defied me," he said softly. Fire me," Tessa shot back, finally turning her head to look at him. Her eyes were tired, dark shadows smudged beneath them. "Throw me back out on the street. But as long as I am taking your money to handle this animal, I am going to handle him." Damien stared at her. He looked at the defiance in her posture, the heavy, uncomfortable swell of her stomach, and the way her hand rested with absolute trust on a 2,000-pound killing machine. Slowly, Damien reached his own hand through the rails. Atlas flinched. The horse's eyes rolled wide, showing white. He prepared to pull back. "Stay," Tessa whispered to the horse. She didn't move her hand from his neck. She just shifted her weight slightly, acting as a physical bridge between the Mafia boss and the Stallion. Damien didn't hesitate. He didn't show fear. He extended his hand and pressed his palm flat against the Stallion's nose. For a long moment, nobody breathed. The heat shimmered in the air. The armed guards stationed around the courtyard watched in stunned silence. Atlas snorted, blowing hot air over Damien's knuckles. Then, the horse lowered his head an inch, accepting the touch. "He smells the gunpowder on you," Tessa said quietly. "It makes him nervous." "Violence is the only currency my world respects," Damien replied, not breaking eye contact with the animal. "If I wash it off, they kill me. It's a lonely way to live." "It's the only way to survive." Damien finally pulled his hand back. He looked at Tessa. He looked down at her stomach. "You look exhausted." "I am carrying a bowling ball on my bladder. Exhausted is my baseline." A sharp, sudden movement caught Tessa off guard. The baby kicked. It wasn't a small flutter. It was a violent, visible roll against her abdominal wall that made her gasp and grip the wooden fence rail. Damien's eyes snapped to her stomach. His jaw clenched. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," Tessa breathed, rubbing the spot through her shirt. "Just active today. He's running out of room." Damien hesitated. The calculating cold boss vanished for a fraction of a second. He looked at her stomach with a strange, intense curiosity. "May I?" he asked. The question was so quiet, it barely carried over the sound of the wind. Tessa looked up at him. She should say no. This was crossing a line. The money, the room, the clothes. That was a transaction. But this was intimate. This was dangerous. She gave a small, jerky nod. Damien reached out. His hand was large, his fingers rough with calluses from handling firearms. He placed his palm gently against the side of her stomach. The heat of his skin bled through the thin fabric of her shirt. He waited. A second later, the baby kicked again, directly against the center of Damien's palm. Damien's breath hitched. His eyes widened slightly, the hard lines of his face softening in a way Tessa had never seen. He stared at his own hand, feeling the undeniable, microscopic force of life pushing back against him. "He's strong," Damien murmured, his voice thick. "He has to be," Tessa said softly. "Look who his mother is." Damien slowly withdrew his hand. He stepped back, re-establishing the physical boundary. But the air between them had fundamentally shifted. The transaction was over. Something far more complicated had taken its place. "5 minutes," Damien said, gesturing to the horse. "Then my men will escort you back to the air conditioning. If you want to see him, you tell me. I will bring him to the window. Do not make me come looking for you again, Tessa." He turned and walked back toward the house. Tessa watched him go, feeling the lingering heat of his hand on her stomach. And for the first time since she had walked through the estate gates, she felt genuinely terrified. Not of the guns, not of the men. She was terrified because she was starting to trust him. It happened in the middle of October, during a torrential downpour that turned the estate grounds to mud and wiped out the main power grid for the entire county. Tessa was 36 weeks along. The backup generators kicked in, flooding the main house with a harsh artificial hum, but the air conditioning struggled. The humidity was oppressive. Tessa woke up at 2 a.m. A dull, tightening ache wrapped around her lower back. She sat up in the heavy darkness of the guest suite, pressing the heels of her hands into her eyes. Braxton Hicks. It had to be. Dr. Caldwell said she had another week, at least. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed. As her feet hit the carpet, a sudden sharp pop echoed in the quiet room. Warm fluid rushed down her legs, soaking the hem of her nightgown and pooling on the floor. Tessa froze. The breath left her lungs in a short, panicked gasp. "No," she whispered in the dark. "No, not yet. Too early." A contraction hit her. It didn't build slowly. It crashed over her like a concrete block, seizing her abdomen with a violence that forced a ragged scream from her throat. Her knees buckled. She hit the floor hard, grabbing the edge of the mattress, her knuckles turning white. The door to her suite flew open. "Tessa!" Damien stood in the doorway. He was wearing dark sweatpants and a t-shirt, a suppressed pistol gripped loosely in his right hand. He had cleared the hallway in under 10 seconds. He saw her on the floor, curled around her stomach, shivering violently. He dropped the gun on the carpet and crossed the room in 2 strides. "The water," Tessa gasped, her teeth chattering. "It broke. It's too early. Damien, it's too early." It was the first time she had used his first name. It slipped out in the panic, raw and unshielded. Damien didn't flinch. He dropped to his knees in the puddle of fluid, sliding his arms under her shoulders and knees. He lifted her effortlessly, ignoring her soaked clothes, and carried her out into the hallway. "Sullivan!" Damien roared. A guard stationed at the end of the hall sprinted forward. "Get Caldwell on the secure line. Tell him to get his ass here right now. If the roads are flooded, tell him to take my helicopter. Go." "Boss, the chopper can't fly in this wind." "I don't care if he has to walk through the mud. Get him here," Damien snarled, kicking open the door to the medical suite. He laid Tessa down on the examination table. The sterile bright lights overhead flickered as the storm raged outside. Another contraction hit her. Tessa screamed, her back arching off the table, her hands grasping blindly in the air. Damien caught her hands. He gripped them tight, his thumbs pressing hard into her knuckles. "Look at me," he commanded. Tessa couldn't. Her eyes were squeezed shut, tears streaming down her pale face. The pain was absolute. It felt like her pelvis was splitting in half. "Tessa, look at me." His voice dropped, losing the roar of the Mafia boss and finding the quiet, steel-reinforced tone of a man holding the line. She opened her eyes. His face was inches from hers. He wasn't looking at the blood. He wasn't looking at the monitors. He was looking directly into her eyes, acting as a focal point in the blinding pain. "Breathe," he said. "It hurts," she sobbed. "The doctor isn't here." "I am here," Damien said. "I am not letting anything happen to you. Do you understand me? I don't lose what is mine." It was a possessive, arrogant statement, but in the sterile, terrifying room, it was exactly what she needed to hear. He was an immovable object. For the next 2 hours, the storm outside was nothing compared to the war inside the room. Dr. Caldwell did not arrive. The bridge leading to the estate had washed out.
They were completely alone.
Damien stripped off his shirt. He used it to wipe the sweat from Tessa's face. He read the medical manuals Caldwell had left in the drawers. He washed his hands in iodine. The man who ordered executions and bought million-dollar horses was now checking dilation with a grim, hyper-focused intensity. "You're fully dilated," Damien said, his voice completely devoid of panic. "The head is right there. Tessa, on the next contraction, you have to push." "I can't," she gasped, her head thrashing against the paper on the table. "I have no strength left." "You pushed a 2-ton horse back from the edge of a panic attack," Damien said, grabbing her shoulders. "You survived the streets. You survived my men. You are the strongest goddamn woman I have ever met. Push." The next wave hit. Tessa screamed, bearing down with every ounce of shattered strength in her body. Damien held her legs, his jaw locked tight, guiding the process with a mechanical, desperate precision. "Again!" he shouted over the thunder rattling the windows. She pushed. The world went white with pain, and then a sound pierced the heavy, humid air of the room. It wasn't a roar. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a thin, wet, furious wail. Tessa collapsed back onto the table, her lungs burning, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't see. Her vision was blurred with sweat and tears. "Damien," she choked out. Panic flared. Is he breathing?" Silence. Tessa forced her head up. Damien was standing at the end of the table. His hands that had ended lives, hands that controlled a criminal empire, were covered in blood and amniotic fluid. In his palms, he held a tiny, screaming, slippery infant. Damien was staring at the child. His chest was heaving. The hard, cynical mask of the Mafia boss was entirely gone. He looked terrified. He looked ruined. He looked like a man who had just discovered the sun existed. He grabbed a sterile towel, quickly and efficiently wrapping the infant. He walked over to the head of the table. He didn't hand the baby to Tessa immediately. He lowered his arms, gently placing the swaddled child against her bare chest. "A boy," Damien whispered, his voice cracking. "He's breathing. He's perfect." Tessa wrapped her shaking, exhausted arms around the tiny bundle. The baby was warm, heavy, and screaming furiously at the cold air. She pressed her lips to the top of his damp head, a sob tearing its way out of her chest. She had done it. She wasn't alone anymore. She looked up at Damien. He was standing right beside her, staring down at the two of them. There was a smear of blood on his cheek. Slowly, Tessa reached out her left hand. Damien looked at it. Then he took it. He laced his long, rough fingers through hers. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The grip was a promise. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside the sterile room, the blood had been washed away by something entirely new. The tether had finally snapped, not breaking them apart, but binding them together in a knot that no amount of violence could ever untie. The dirt washes away, but the marks we leave on each other remain forever. From a terrified stallion to a ruthless boss, Tessa proved that true power isn't about the gun you hold, but the gentle palm you offer in the dark. Did Damien's transformation leave you speechless? What was your favorite moment of this intense journey? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Hit that like button if you want more grounded, gritty romance stories. And don't forget to subscribe and share this video so you never miss our next epic tale.